The dishes were already dry, but I kept wiping the same wine glass over and over. From the kitchen window, I had a perfect view of the neighbor's porch. He was outside again, fiddling with a ladder, shirtless despite the lingering spring chill. His back moved with quiet strength, muscles flexing as he twisted a light bulb into place. I knew I should have looked away, but I didn't. He was new, just a few months on our street. Quiet. Alone. Most days he wore the same worn gray t-shirt and jeans, but today there was nothing between him and the light but skin. I stared longer than necessary, long enough to feel something shift inside me. Something I hadn't felt in years. Not butterflies. More like heat rising from a stove you forgot to turn off. That night, I couldn't sleep. My husband was snoring beside me, his body turned away as usual. I stared at the ceiling and wondered when I last felt noticed. Desired. Not loved. My husband loved me, I never doubted that, but seen. Aware of the curve of my back, the way my skin prickled when air touched certain places. It wasn't that he had grown cold. He simply stopped looking. The next morning, without thinking, I chose the red lace bra from the back of the drawer. The one I used to save for anniversaries. I put it on under a plain sweater, feeling oddly defiant, as if I were slipping into someone else's skin. My reflection in the mirror wasn't different, but I stood a little straighter. Later that day, I trimmed the roses in our front yard. I told myself I just needed fresh air, but I knew it was something else. And there he was, watering a line of herbs along his fence. He waved casually. I waved back, pretending my stomach didn't flutter. At dinner, my husband talked about taxes, deadlines. I nodded, said all the right things, and sipped wine to keep my mouth busy. My body was present, but a part of me remained at the fence, where glances lingered longer than they should. When I lay in bed that night, the red lace still on beneath my nightshirt, I realized this wasn't just a moment. It was a door. And I hadn't decided whether to close it or step through. I didn't plan on walking past his garage that day. It just happened. Like most of the things we convince ourselves are accidents when we want them more than we admit. I was carrying a basket of folded laundry back from the line when I saw him crouched beside an open toolbox. The scent of motor oil hung faintly in the air, mixed with something sharper. Citrusy, like soap or maybe aftershave. He looked up. "You know anything about hedge trimmers?" he asked with a grin, holding up a tangled cord. I didn't, but I stepped closer. The garage wasn't messy like my husband's. It was organized, clean in a way that felt lived in rather than obsessive. Tools hung in perfect rows. A bike leaned gently in the corner. There was music playing low on an old speaker. Some slow blues I didn't recognize, but that matched the heat settling between us. He handed me the trimmer as if I might fix it. I turned it over uselessly, aware of how close he was. My arm brushed his when I reached for the handle, and I didn't move away. His forearm was warm, solid. It wasn't the first time I'd touched a man like that, but it felt like the first time someone had touched me in years. "You smell like oranges," he murmured, not looking at me. I hadn't worn perfume, just my usual lotion. But the way he said it, it landed in the pit of my stomach and spread like heat. Our eyes met. Neither of us smiled. I don't remember who leaned in first. It was slow, careful, as if we were trying not to startle the moment. His lips were warmer than I expected. Gentle at first, then more certain. His hand didn't grope or grip. It simply rested on the small of my back, firm enough to let me know he was there, but soft enough to leave the decision to me. And I didn't pull away. The kiss didn't last long. It wasn't frantic or cinematic. It was quiet. Breath against breath. My fingers clutched the fabric of his shirt without realizing. When I finally stepped back, there was no apology between us. Just a long look, as if we both knew something had cracked open and couldn't be closed again. I walked home without looking back. The laundry in the basket suddenly felt too light. My chest, too full. In the bathroom mirror, my cheeks were flushed. Not from embarrassment, but from something far more dangerous. That night, I lay beside my husband and stared at the ceiling again. His breathing was steady, his warmth familiar, and yet my body still tingled where the neighbor's hand had rested. I didn't feel guilty. I felt awake. I started noticing the small changes before he ever said a word. The way he looked at me during dinner. Longer, searching, as though trying to locate something just beneath the surface. My husband wasn't a man of suspicion. He was a man of routine, predictable in his love, his habits, even in the way he buttered his toast. But when I caught him watching me as I slipped my heels on for the grocery store, eyebrows slightly raised, I felt it. He was noticing. And maybe that was the cruelest part. He noticed only when something in me had already shifted. Not when I cried quietly after another night of mechanical intimacy. Not when I stopped wearing makeup or sleeping in anything other than an old t-shirt. But now, when I finally started choosing lace again, curling my hair just slightly, he noticed. And yet he said nothing. That evening, I found him standing in the hallway with my phone in his hand. It was unlocked. Nothing scandalous on the screen. Just a photo I had taken earlier of the rose bush blooming in the front yard. I had sent the same image to the neighbor, captioned, "She opened up late this year, but completely." My husband didn't ask about the photo. He simply turned the screen toward me and said, "You've been spending more time outside lately." I nodded. It's spring. He held the phone a second longer than necessary before setting it on the kitchen counter and returning to his usual spot on the couch. The moment passed, but not without leaving something unsettled in the air between us. I wanted him to ask. I wanted him to press. But he didn't. The next day, he brought home wine. The kind we used to drink when we first moved in, before schedules and silence took over. He poured 2 glasses and said, "We should go out. Maybe to that little bistro near the harbor. You used to love it there." I smiled politely. "I'm tired. Let's stay in." It wasn't a lie. I was tired, but not from errands or work. I was tired of performing affection that felt more like duty than desire. We ate dinner together, and he reached for my hand across the table. I let him hold it. His palm was warm, familiar. But I felt like I was gripping memory instead of skin. That night, in bed, he kissed my shoulder. The gesture was tender, well-meaning. I closed my eyes and pretended I didn't feel the echo of another hand, another breath, another mouth against mine just days earlier. I hated myself for comparing, and hated him for making me feel like I had to. As he slept, I picked up my phone and scrolled past emails and calendars until I reached the message from the neighbor. Just one line. That rose wasn't the only thing that bloomed today. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. My body already had. She showed up with pastries, a box of lemon danishes from the bakery downtown, the ones she knew I liked. She handed them over with a bright smile, but her eyes were already scanning the kitchen. That was her way. Cheerful intrusion masked as concern. We'd known each other for years. Shared school drop-offs, yoga classes, wine-soaked confessions. But today there was something sharper under her friendliness. A flicker of curiosity dressed up as kindness. "I saw your neighbor the other day," she said, reaching for a coffee cup without asking. Shirt off, sweat on his back, working hard on that garden of his. I kept my expression neutral, stirring cream into my mug. "He's out there a lot. Keeps busy." She laughed softly, almost to herself. "He's interesting, isn't he? A little quiet, but something about him, I don't know. Dangerous in that laid-back kind of way." I felt the heat rise up my neck. Not from guilt, but from recognition. She saw it too. The quiet magnetism. The way he looked at people like he actually saw them, not just through them. And for a split second, I wondered if she was circling me. Or him. She went on. "I saw him talking to someone. Blonde. Pretty. Didn't look like family." A pause. "Maybe someone he's dating?" I nodded slowly, pretending not to care. But inside, something turned. I hadn't let myself imagine him with someone else. I had claimed no ownership, no expectations, and yet her words felt like a hand around my throat, slow and deliberate. Jealousy wasn't something I had expected, not from a kiss, not from a few loaded silences and one message about a rose. After she left, the silence in the house felt louder. I carried the pastries to the counter but didn't eat any. Instead, I walked to the bedroom, pulled open the closet, and stared at my clothes. Blouses, cardigans, jeans in every shade of beige. I dug past them until I found the black silk slip buried in the back. I hadn't worn it in years, not because it didn't fit, but because it felt unnecessary, overly intimate for the life I'd been living. I slipped it on just to see. My reflection startled me. The fabric clung to me in a way that felt unfamiliar, dangerous even. My skin looked warmer, softer, my eyes darker. I didn't look like a woman waiting on permission. I looked like someone making a choice. That night, I made dinner in silence. My husband was in the garage fixing something that didn't need fixing. We barely spoke. Not from anger, but from exhaustion. The kind that comes when two people stop reaching. When I lay in bed later, I didn't think of the blonde woman. I thought of his hand on my back, the steadiness of his touch. I thought about how my own body had leaned in without hesitation. Not because it was starving, but because it finally recognized something that fed it. And then I wondered, not for the first time, if this was a mistake, why did it feel like the most honest thing I'd done in years? It was his idea. A simple invitation, sent like a casual suggestion. Heading to that outdoor furniture expo tomorrow. Wanna come? Could use a second opinion. The message sat on my screen for a full minute before I typed, sure, then erased it. Wrote, maybe, then deleted that too. Finally, I settled on, if I can sneak away. There was no need to sneak. My husband was busy with work, tied up in endless phone calls and spreadsheets. He kissed my cheek that morning, distracted, already halfway into another conversation as he grabbed his keys. I stood there in the hallway for a second after the door closed, listening to the emptiness settle back around me like dust. I wore jeans and a loose blouse, but underneath, black lace. Not for seduction. For me, a reminder, a secret held close to the skin. He picked me up around noon in a borrowed van, his hair still damp from a shower. The drive started in silence, filled only by the soft hum of an old jazz playlist. I watched the road ahead, the curve of his forearm on the steering wheel. Occasionally, our eyes met at stoplights. Nothing was said, but everything vibrated with potential. At the expo, we wandered between booths, laughing at overpriced patio heaters and absurdly large hammocks. He handed me a lemonade without asking. I drank it too fast, nervous energy needing somewhere to go. The air was hot, the sunlight sharp, and when the clouds finally rolled in, I was grateful for the sudden coolness. On the way back, rain began to fall. First gentle, then insistent, thick drops smearing the windshield. He pulled off the highway toward a small roadside motel, saying something about waiting it out. The lot was nearly empty. The woman at the counter barely looked up when he paid in cash. The room smelled faintly of bleach and something floral. The curtains were drawn. A television bolted to the wall played static behind glass. He didn't move to touch me right away. Instead, he set the lemonade down on the nightstand and sat, elbows on knees, as if waiting for a signal. I stood across from him, arms crossed, heart loud. When I finally stepped closer, his hand found the hem of my blouse. Not to pull it off, but just to feel it. He looked up at me, his fingers resting against my hip. My breath caught. I didn't speak. The kiss was slower than the first, more certain, less cautious. It spread through me like warmth from a single lit match in a cold room. His hands were still polite, but firmer now, mapping places I thought had been forgotten. I didn't think about consequences. Not in that moment. I thought about breath, heat, and the way his palm curved to my waist like it belonged there. We didn't stay long, maybe 20 minutes, long enough for my lipstick to wear off, long enough to remember I had a home to return to. But as he drove me back, fingers brushing mine on the gear shift, I knew something had shifted permanently. I didn't feel like I was cheating. I felt like I had remembered myself. He brought me breakfast, not the neighbor, my husband. 2 slices of buttered toast, a soft-boiled egg, and coffee with precisely the amount of cream I preferred. He even placed a folded napkin beside the plate, like I was a guest in my own home. I thanked him softly, watching his face. There was something in the gesture. Earnestness, maybe even guilt, but it came wrapped in routine. I realized then that he was trying in the only way he knew how, by repeating familiar kindnesses, by offering safety instead of desire. The night before, I had lain beside him in bed as he touched me with careful hands. No urgency, no hunger, just slow, practiced movements. He kissed my neck, my collarbone, and eventually settled over me like a question I no longer wanted to answer. I let him. I made the right sounds. I closed my eyes and tried to disappear into memory. But my body refused to respond the way it once had. His skin felt like comfort. His breath like a habit. There was no disgust, no revulsion, only distance. A quiet void that stretched between our bodies even when they were pressed together. Afterwards, he rested a hand on my thigh, a gesture of closeness that felt more like punctuation. I waited for the familiar wave of guilt to rise, but it never came. Not that night. Not the morning after. Instead, I moved through the day with a sense of eerie clarity. Folding laundry, answering emails, watering the roses. Every movement deliberate, like I was studying myself from the outside. My reflection in the hallway mirror looked rested, but not at peace. Around noon, I changed into a pale linen dress I hadn't worn in months. It brushed lightly against my skin, the fabric thin enough to remind me of bare legs in summer. I wore no bra. I told myself it was for comfort. I didn't quite believe it. I caught my husband watching me as I moved through the kitchen. His gaze lingered a second too long on the dip of my waist, the way the dress clung when I reached overhead. He looked as though he wanted to say something, but instead, he returned to his tablet, flicking through headlines with tight lips. The silence between us was no longer passive. It was heavy now, dense with things neither of us dared name. I wondered if he sensed the shift, if he could feel it like a draft through a sealed window. That evening, I received a message. Not words, just a photo. A bloom from the neighbor's garden, deep crimson with petals curling slightly at the edges. Attached was a single phrase, "Still opening." I stared at the image for a long time, thumb hovering over the reply box, then set the phone down without typing a single letter. Later, as the sky darkened, I stood barefoot on the porch, arms wrapped around myself, and looked toward the house next door. His lights were on. A shadow moved behind the curtains. I didn't want to go to him. I wanted him to come to me. It was a small thing, a passing comment, barely a sentence. But it landed with the precision of a scalpel. I was standing in line at the bakery when she appeared beside me. Her voice, light and casual as always, floated between us as she leaned in to admire the cherry pastries behind the glass. "Saw your neighbor again," she said, plucking a loyalty card from her wallet. "He was walking downtown yesterday, not alone this time." I turned to her slowly. She smiled, almost apologetically, then added, "Blonde, tall. Younger, I think." They looked cozy. The words didn't sink in all at once. They settled slowly like oil on water, bright, floating, impossible to ignore. I nodded, said something vague in response, paid for my croissants, and left before my pulse betrayed me. The rest of the morning passed in fragments. I cleaned the kitchen twice, not because it was dirty, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I reorganized the spices. I dusted the blinds. But none of it settled the static inside my chest. Jealousy was not an emotion I had allowed myself. Not here. Not with him. I had drawn no boundaries, made no promises, demanded nothing. I told myself it was freedom, that what passed between us was a spark, not a fire. But hearing about another woman, someone real, someone seen with him, tugged at a thread I hadn't known was loose. I found myself at the edge of my yard by late afternoon, pretending to prune the roses even though they needed nothing. My eyes kept flicking to his porch, waiting for a glimpse. The wind lifted the hem of my dress, and I didn't bother to smooth it down. When he finally stepped out, hair tousled, phone to his ear, I froze. He didn't see me. Or if he did, he didn't look long enough to signal anything. Later, after dinner, I sat in the living room while my husband watched some crime documentary, his attention fully absorbed by the flickering screen. I stared at the blue glow painting his face and wondered how many hours we'd spent like this. Quiet, present, and utterly disconnected. My phone vibrated on the side table. "You walked past today. You looked like someone who belonged to no one." I read the message 3 times. My throat tightened, not from guilt, but from longing. That line, simple as it was, felt more intimate than anything I'd heard in my own home for years. I didn't answer. I set the phone face down and went upstairs to shower. As the hot water ran over my shoulders, I closed my eyes and pressed my forehead to the tile. My body remembered his touch like an echo, not fading but looping. His absence today stung more than it should have. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something I had no name for, and it terrified me. When I climbed into bed that night, my husband was already asleep, the blankets rising and falling in quiet rhythm. I lay beside him, eyes open, heart loud. I didn't want to belong to anyone. But I wanted him to want me anyway. He suggested a weekend away. It was subtle, almost clumsy, as though he was afraid the idea itself might offend me. We were clearing the dishes after dinner, nothing special, just pasta and silence. When he leaned on the edge of the counter and said, "We haven't had time together in a while. There's a place by the lake. Thought maybe you'd want a change of scenery." I didn't answer right away. My hands were still damp, fingers curled around a dish towel. I watched him, really watched him for the first time in weeks, maybe longer. There was sincerity in his face, a kind of nervous hopefulness I hadn't seen since our early days. The effort was real. And still I felt nothing rise to meet it. Only an ache that his timing had arrived too late. The next morning, he packed the bags, button-downs, books he wouldn't read, a bottle of wine I once mentioned I liked. I let him believe I was coming. Let him talk about the cabin and the quiet, how we could cook together and reconnect. The word made my skin itch. We drove for nearly an hour before I asked to stop at a gas station just outside the city. I stepped out of the car, said I needed the restroom, and walked toward the store. The air was thick with early summer heat. A bird screeched somewhere high above. Inside the station, I passed the coffee machines and stood in the back corner for a full minute, heart pounding. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I reached for my phone and typed one sentence. "Want to meet for coffee?" No location, no explanation, just that. It wasn't calculated. It was instinct. His reply came faster than I expected. "Already brewing." I turned around and walked straight back to the car. My husband was leaning on the driver's door, looking at his watch. I smiled softly and told him I wasn't feeling well, that the trip might have to wait. His brows furrowed, confusion passing like a shadow over his face, but he didn't protest. He handed me the keys and offered to drive home. I said no. I needed to go alone. The roads I took were familiar, but felt sharper, more defined. I didn't blast music or call anyone. I drove with the windows half open, letting the wind undo my hair. I wasn't running. I wasn't chasing. I was moving toward something, and at the same time away from everything else. We met at a small cafe by the ocean, the kind of place with chipped saucers and handwritten menus. He was already seated outside, a second cup in front of the empty chair across from him. Neither of us stood up. We just looked at each other. Not with hunger, not with shame, with recognition. As though all the silences between us had finally taken shape. I sat, took a sip, let the bitterness coat my tongue. Around us, seagulls called, children laughed in the distance, and life went on. But at that table, everything held still. He didn't ask what had changed. He didn't need to. It was written across my shoulders in the tension of my jaw, in the way my fingers curled around the ceramic cup like it was the only solid thing left. I wasn't sure what I'd say when the coffee cooled, but I knew I wasn't going back. Not yet. The cafe emptied slowly as the sky deepened into a bruise-colored dusk. We didn't talk much. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was rich, full of things that didn't need to be said aloud. He sat across from me, fingers loosely wrapped around his coffee cup, eyes steady. There was no expectation in his gaze, no questions pressing against the air. Just presence. It felt strange at first to be seen without being asked to explain myself. With my husband, even silence had weight. Questions unspoken but hovering, judgments soft and unintentional. Here, across from this man I barely knew and yet felt completely known by, I felt none of that. A breeze rose from the ocean and tugged at the hem of my dress. I felt the shift in my body before I processed the thought. How alert my skin was, how aware I had become of my own movement, posture, breath. My sense of being had returned. Not in a triumphant way, but like water soaking slowly into dry ground. He finally leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice quiet. "You look tired. Not in the usual way. In the way people do when they've been carrying something too long." I didn't reply. I just looked out toward the waves, the slow crash and retreat of water smoothing the edges of my thoughts. "I left this morning," I said eventually. "Midway to a weekend trip. I told him I wasn't feeling well." "Were you?" I paused. Not in the way he thought. He nodded once, like that was enough. No probing, no request for more. It felt like mercy. We walked the beach after that, shoes in hand, letting the sand cool our feet. The sky was nearly dark when I turned toward him and said, "I don't know what I'm doing." His answer was simple. "Most of us don't." I didn't stay the night. I didn't follow him home, didn't fall into bed, didn't make promises I couldn't keep. I left when the stars came out, alone in my car, hands firm on the wheel. When I got home, the house was dark. My husband had fallen asleep on the couch again, a blanket half draped over his chest, the television casting pale flickers across the room. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. His quiet mouth, the crease between his brows that never seemed to leave anymore. I didn't feel anger, or guilt, or longing. I felt distance. A deep, irreversible distance that no weekend trip or wine or apology could close. In the bathroom, I washed my face slowly, removed my earrings, let down my hair. I looked at my reflection. Not the woman who had been kissed in a garage, or the wife who made excuses, or the mother who folded laundry while her thoughts ran wild. Just me. When I crawled into bed, I didn't reach for him. I didn't need to. I had made my choice, even if I hadn't spoken it yet. And I knew the hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was the realization that I wasn't sorry,